Our next speaker is Doug Kelbaugh. He's an acclaimed writer. He's a dean, a professor. I had a few minutes to speak with him earlier. His topic is going to be about urbanism and how the city itself can be a key player in combating climate change. So we're going to hand over the microphone to him and let him take us through that. I also want to lastly recognize all the other partners and sponsors that you see up on the panel. They're all contributed and helped out to make this a success. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Doug.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and we've had some great talks. I mean, I don't want to single them all out, but those parks we just saw right before lunch are just amazing. We really are in a golden age for cities right now. Let's hope we can sustain it. So the built environment, especially the city, is our biggest economic investment. We spend more money on it than on education or healthcare or you name it. It's also one of the most empowering and monumental achievements of humankind. Long lived, it embodies culture, making connections across the past, present, and future. But why is it so relevant right now? I'm going to give you my 3 reasons. They're not all accompanied by Chicago imagery, but urbanism until recently has been underappreciated in the US, going back to Thomas Jefferson, really, who was against cities, which has tried to have it, the US has always tried to have it both ways with suburbia. And single buildings by starchitects have dominated the media. The second is just this tsunami of global urban development. This happens to be Shanghai. It's particularly fast in Asia, but also South America. So in 1800, there were about 30 million people living in cities, about 3% of the world population. It's about 55% now, almost 4 billion. Urbanization in the developed world has largely come to an end. It's not happening so much in the United States and Europe. Nearly everyone who would move from farmland to cities has already done it. This century, the same mass migration will run its course across the rest of the world. More than half of us now live in cities, but it might come as more of a surprise to learn that the largest 300 cities shown here on this map account for nearly half the world economic output, with only 19% of the world population. So cities box well above their weight, about 2.5 times their share. Especially China. China is developing mega cities at 10 times the US rate, in spite of their recent one-child policy, which has been relaxed, as you know, but still they have small families. By 2050, developing world cities are projected to gain 2.3 billion people. Many of those people will move to makeshift settlements on the edge of existing cities, so-called favelas or informal settlements, tripling the urbanized area in the developing world. This is Mexico City, one example. The third reason is ecological crises and climate change. This is what Boston could look like with a relatively small rise in sea level. Much of Boston was originally landfill to begin with. So cities account for more than 70% of all CO2 emissions, and they consume about 2/3 of the world's energy. So how the heck can they be good? I mean, we're getting more floods, fires, storms, and drought because of climate change. And yet cities, you'll see, if you stick with me, have a key role, maybe our last best chance. This is coastal flooding with climate change refugees flocking from the coast, or beginning to flock. It's going to accelerate, of course, to receiver cities, which are either immediately on higher ground or distant receiver cities like Detroit or Chicago. You can read these. Florida residents are projected to migrate away from Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, under a 1.8 meter sea level rise scenario. San Francisco, New York, etc., will be impacted, with some pretty radical ideas being proposed. Look at this one connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan, the East River. I don't know if this is in the cards by any means, but we're talking about big bucks. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, in 2012 said the road to sustainability runs through the world's towns and cities. By building sustainable towns and cities, you will build global sustainability. The country is the sum of cities. If cities do not work, the countries cannot work. So how can cities help? Well, first of all, they're huge economic engines. 90% of our GDP and 86% of our jobs are generated in our metro area on just 3% of the land in the US. Ed Glazer's excellent book, The Triumph of the Cities, talks about how cities do it better. Wages and productivity rise with density. The bigger and denser, the greater the creation of wealth. Ironically, proximity has become ever more valuable as the cost of connecting across long distances has fallen because of cell phones and so on. We're better connected electronically, but the desire to live in face-to-face proximity has actually increased. Here's that productivity rise, 6 to 28%, when job density doubles. It goes up, somewhere between 6 and 28%. Now, this I find astounding. Some economists have concluded that more than half that variation of the 6 to 28% increase in output per worker in the US can be explained by density alone. Density explains more of this gap than education levels, or industry concentration, or tax policies. I find it, as an educator, a little threatening, actually. Here we are. Look at the urbanized states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and so on. They're just richer. Hourly earnings are higher to the higher you go on the chart to the right. Alaska is an outlier for other reasons. A wonderful quote by Glazer is, cities don't make people poor. They attract poor people. Public policy should help poor people, not poor places. I agree with the first half. I don't agree with the second sentence, because I think a city like Detroit, which already has a lot of good infrastructure, does deserve investment. It's not, he says just give the money to poor people wherever they are, and that'll be the highest and best use of your dollars, but I don't agree. Then he goes on to make another great point. Cities are learning machines. Humanity is a social species, and our greatest gift is our ability to learn from each other. Cities thrive by enabling that learning, and they have become only more important as our knowledge economy grows. Some very recent research suggests that living in a complex city makes you more complex and able to deal better with complexity. When people live close to one another, they hatch plans, they trade services, they discuss terrible ideas until eventually they arrive at some good ones. Okay, the city is an organism in some ways, in other ways it's not. So this is an amazing law, Kleiber's law, that I didn't know about until maybe 5 years ago. It turns out that almost all creatures get about the same number of heartbeats in their lifetime. It's just that some hearts beat faster and some much slower. If you plotted mass versus metabolism, the result is a straight line, from birds and rats and pigeons all the way up to bulls and elephants. It's not exactly a straight line, but it's close enough to be a very compelling argument. Another way of looking at Kleiber's law is metabolism, heart rate, increases more slowly than size or weight. Double a city and its energy consumption doesn't double, it goes up about 70%. This is really good news. Here are various organisms with their heartbeats. The blue whale with the slowest, hummingbird with probably the fastest. So they all get the same number of heartbeats, and importantly, they all die. All organisms die. But ecosystems don't have to die. They can live a long time. This is Jeffrey West, a physicist, on the city as an organism, not an ecosystem. If an elephant is just a scaled-up mouse, then a city is just a scaled-up elephant. The road surface area, the utility lines, the gasoline stations, the sales increase slower. The metabolic rate slows down. You have a slower metabolic rate here in Chicago than we do in Detroit. Kleiber's law, this is another wonderful little bit of luck. Kleiber's law is reversed, though, when it comes to creativity and innovation. A metropolis that is 50 times bigger than a town is 130 times more innovative. More good news. It's very hard to measure creativity and innovation. Unfortunately, one of the few ways is patents per capita. And you can see here's a city with twice the job density, and it has about 20% more patents per capita. But we all know the arts, whether it's music, dance, architecture, sculpture, painting, thrive in urban settings. But there's just no metric for that. All right, so that was the city as an organism. What about as an ecosystem? Some of the terms you may have heard over the years: reconciliation ecology, this is a new term of mine, the environmental paradox of cities. You've heard, many of you, of the urban heat island or the urban heat island effect. We'll talk about these. So ecology spans a number of levels of organization, as you can see on the chart on the left, from a suborganism to an organism to a population of organisms to a real community and then to an ecosystem. So the organism is a sort of single creature which has, as I've said, a discrete lifetime. Ecosystems are much longer lived. You might think maybe that buildings are sort of like organism and the whole city. Individual buildings are like organisms. The whole city is an ecosystem. And it's important to clarify the difference between analogy and reality. The city is not analogous to an ecosystem. The city is an ecosystem. Human settlements are as natural as colonies of prairie dogs or beds of oysters or hives of bees. People watching in cities is as much about nature as bird watching in the countryside. Apologies to Jen, I think you just saw so much of this. Anyway, unlike organisms, animals, plants, corporations are organisms, they don't live forever. Ecosystems don't have such a finite lifespan, nor do cities. Think how old Cairo is, or Rome, or Jerusalem, or you name it. They've been around a long time. Not everyone sees cities as natural. Most of you probably don't think of cities as natural, like a bird nest. We have this idea that there's the urban world and then there's nature, and we're the only species that looks at landscape that way, because it's not like when a bird flies into Boston and goes, oh, I'm in a city now. The bird doesn't differentiate, nor should we. Just because there's a lot of hardscape doesn't mean it's not nature. What environmentalists like to talk about and urbanists don't like to talk about. Cities are acts of violence. The city is an ecological compromise as relief and counterpoint to natural areas. They're both natural, as I've said, but by natural areas I mean the ones less touched by humankind. They are primary habitat for our species and secondary habitat for animals and plants. I mean, yes, we have beautiful plants right out this window, and we have some animals and lots of birds in cities, but that's not it's not their primary habitat. Cities are mainly for us. What environmentalists don't like to talk about and urbanists do like to talk about. They are necessary ecological sacrifice zones to a large extent, but they perform an ecological role in the larger sense by providing compact habitat for humans, preserving natural habitat for other species. The more compact, the better. Now back to what environmentalists like to talk about and urbanists don't like to talk about. Stuart Brand writes about reconciliation ecology, urban ecology, the socio-ecological as opposed to restoration ecology. For instance, you can't daylight all the streams, unpipe all the water flow in a city. It's just impossible. There's nothing, we just can't do that. The denser the city, though, the less development of rural land is our reply. Charleston, how many of you ever been to Charleston, South Carolina? It's a wonderful city. Do I have a pointer? Yeah. I used to live as a very young kid south of Broad. I don't think this works. I used to live right about here. This is Broad on Church Street, the famous street where the church sticks out. My mother would walk us down in her saddle shoe high heels, pushing a pram down to the Battery Park, where the first shot was fired to from Fort Sumter. And it just happens my first wife's great-grandfather was the guy who fired that first shot. And my brother still lives there. So I have some strange connections to Charleston, which I think is about as good, particularly south of Broad, as urban America gets. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. Now, here's the problem. It wouldn't be allowed to be built today. Today, we'd have to build it like this. So I guess my argument is there are some marshes that are worth sacrificing. Venice, for instance. You wouldn't be allowed to build Venice now because it's in a very sensitive marsh area. But I think we'd agree, as Ian McHarg, the great ecologist himself said, few among us regret the loss of ancient marshes on which Venice and Amsterdam sit, the loss of even more ancient hills which now seat Athens and Rome. So we have to balance these issues. Some laws of urban scaling. As cities grow, the number of interactions increases at the square of the population. As cities get bigger, income and wealth increase. We've talked about that. As cities get larger, there are less of them. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And as cities get bigger, they get more sustainable. This is what I call the environmental paradox of cities, which is sort of Kleiber's law applied. Cities have huge footprints, so how can they be ecologically green? Look at London. It takes a land area 125 times bigger than the city proper to support itself. Not only to provide the food and the resources, but also to absorb its waste, which is considerable. So it has a big eco footprint. There are these negative impacts. They have big eco footprints, they consume lots of resources, they produce lots of waste, including greenhouse gases, which, as you know, contribute to climate change. And when they're building, like in Asia, new and expanding cities, it's even worse because these construction cranes and equipment run often 24/7. So this is a pretty damning chart for cities. On the top, in 2010, 66% of the world energy consumption was in cities. It's projected to go to 79% by 2040. So they do produce a lot of CO2 while they consume all that energy. And yet, this paradox. This is a very famous chart done by Scott Bernstein, who was celebrated last night, at the 40th anniversary of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, a local Chicago organization. How many people know CNT? It's a wonderful group. So this, God, are the colors vivid with this? The saturation and brightness are amazing. Anyway, here's your city. You think, actually this pointer does work, but it won't work with reverse projection. So there's Chicago on the left, there's the loop, you know where that is roughly, and this is greenhouse gases produced, and obviously very intense in the center of the city. You move out to the inner city neighborhoods, the outer city neighborhoods, the inner suburbs, the outer suburbs, the rural areas. Greenhouse production goes down per acre, but Scott was the first guy to put people in the denominator, and then all of a sudden it's just the opposite. The greenest part of Chicago is where we are right now in terms of per capita production of greenhouse gases. This was a earth-shaking chart. Thank you, Scott. So here's the way I would define the paradox. When people cluster in dense, mixed-use cities rather than sprawl, they have a big footprint. But their ecological footprint per capita is smaller than in low-density patterns of development. So cities may not look green, but they are. All that economic investment in buildings and infrastructure is a good eco-investment. So that was, his chart was just looking at transportation. If you include heating and cooling buildings and lighting them, which is a little more complicated, and the materials to build them, it gets even more dramatic. So here's a low density area on the upper bar. Red is transportation. Building operations are purple. That includes heating, lighting, and cooling. And then green is the actual energy embodied in the materials that went into the steel and the whatever materials this building and other buildings are made out of in cities. So suburbia is much worse, and it has other problems like toxic fertilizer pollution of lakes and streams and so on. This is a big difference, folks, between high and low density, more than twofold. This is Toronto. Here's Atlanta on the left and Barcelona on the right. Atlanta is known as a sprawling American metropolis. Barcelona is not that unusual, actually, for Europe. There are many cities just as dense. Who showed, Kit, did you show Barcelona with the superblock? Somebody did. Yeah. All right, so the population, when this chart was done, was 2.5 million people in greater Atlanta and about 2.8 in all of greater Barcelona, even though, as you can see, it's very compact. So the bottom line is the transportation, as we say, carbon emissions, is about 10 times greater in Atlanta than Barcelona. And you can see the difference in urban area. I can't do the math, but it's 25 or 30 times more compact. This is pretty compelling, I think. It's not quite that simple with all cities. Almost all cities, though, the more compact, mixed use they are, the greater their energy and eco and carbon benefits are. For instance, living in the average US versus New York City. New York's much better. Brussels better than Belgium, and so on and so on. But there are two examples here where it's reversed. The people who move from the countryside to Beijing get so much richer, even though they have smaller families. The per capita greenhouse gas production goes up. And it's true in a city like Stuttgart because there's so much industry, as you know, making all those BMWs. That it goes up. But generally, moving to cities means smaller footprints. On his second point Tailpipe and chimney emissions not only produce greenhouse gases, but they also produce sensible heat. This is hot, just plain hot air coming out of tailpipes and chimneys. That warms the local climate. It has nothing whatsoever to do with climate change. It's just plain hot air, nothing to do with greenhouse gases that capture energy and keep it on the earth. So this is sort of interesting. We know that downtowns are hotter than their suburban hinterland, quite a bit hotter. We know that just from our typical daily lives. Here's another chart showing the higher temperatures downtown tapering off to the suburbs and the countryside. This is the buildup of sensible heat and also from dark surfaces that get heated up by the sun. It's not the same thing as greenhouse gas heating. It's a local, not a global phenomenon. It's a double whammy though, because these cities are getting hotter because of the greenhouse effect and the local heat island effect. These are very old, but this shows the heat island in Atlanta in 72 and then in 93. I don't have more recent stuff, I'm sorry, but Atlanta has lost in the last 25 years about half its tree cover, and Seattle about a third. Large cities in the US tend to be warming at more than twice the rate of the planet as a whole, or by the way, of their local countryside. As a result, to a large extent, of just less naturally vegetated land covers, less trees and so on, global estimates of climate change are likely to underestimate rates of warming in the very places where most of the global population now resides, and more will live. So ironically, we're getting often misleading information. This is Philadelphia. Here's some temperatures. Surface temperatures, you can see up to 117 degrees. Actually, on that car on the far right, 164 degrees. And then look over on the far left under the shade of those trees, it's only 84. It's a difference of almost 2 to 1. It's immense. Philadelphia is already experiencing hotter and wetter weather due to climate change. Some neighborhoods can be as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than others. Dark surfaces are a problem. And it often aligns with poverty. This is Oakland, California. On the left are surface temperatures. You can see the hottest areas in the darkest red, moving to sort of towards black. And then look where the rich people live and the poor people live. The poor people live in the hot areas, the rich people live in the cooler areas. Things like this are happening. Construction jobs are starting an hour earlier than they used to, and it's still hot. You'll see more and more of this, where they just start earlier and earlier. Heat waves are a huge problem. In 2003, there was a particularly bad one in Europe that led to 45,000 deaths. In 2010, another 54,000 were killed in Russia. And we're going to experience, as Americans, 2.5 times as many of these dangerously hot, humid days. And heat waves kill more people than all other natural disasters put together. More if you add flooding and tornadoes and volcanic eruptions, you name it. Heat waves kill more than all those put together. Here you can see surface temperatures across the city. More paved, more built on the left, less on the right. Surface temperatures across the urban transect. It wasn't air temperature, humidity, or wind speed that had the greatest effect on personal comfort. It was shade. In another study conducted on a playground, the differences in surface temperature between shaded and unshaded asphalt was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty dramatic. We'll see more of this. Here's another chart showing it in a tabular form, or a chart where you can see both urban and rural temperatures are going up, but they're maintaining that gap of the urban heat island. It's mainly a function of albedo, which is the reflectivity of materials in a city versus the countryside, and this waste heat coming from tailpipes and chimneys. I don't know why Louisville is so bad, but you can see Detroit's also pretty bad. Where is Chicago on this list? I should know. It's not. Is it? No. So it could be worse. So this is a big point in my book. If ways to mitigate and adapt to urban heat islands are complementary to ways to address climate change, how might the urban heat island effect actually help us? And here's my argument. Because it's a 5 to 10 year rather than a 50 to 100 year challenge, it can motivate people to modify their behavior with more immediate, palpable feedback on a more manageable challenge. It's just simply more manageable. On the other hand, we don't want to scare people away from cities by letting them know they're hotter than the suburbs if they don't already know it. So this is interesting. It's a more manageable issue. So I think we're lucky. Strategies to mitigate and adapt to urban heat islands are not only consistent with, they're identical to strategies to deal with climate change. What good luck. So here's the way you deal with urban heat islands. Albedo enhancement is a fancy way of saying just lighter colored roofs, pavements, and also walls. So a light covered pavement can reflect up to 4 times more than a dark one. Unfortunately, asphalt is pretty dark. You have to go to unit pavers to get lighter surface colors. Color is a big deal. This poor guy in India has lost his shoes to the asphalt, and this picture I took in Rome a couple years ago, where shop owners, where they have dark sidewalks, there are some asphalt sidewalks in Rome, they go out and sprinkle water on them all day long to cool them off. So unit pavers are better because you can get much lighter colors. You can also get better, less runoff because they're more permeable. Now this lower right image is brand new. I find it remarkable. These are guys and women painting Los Angeles streets white. They're doing that right now as we speak. They're painting streets white. I mean, I don't know if it's literally, they're not using brushes that look like big squeegees, but that's to reduce to improve the albedo so less heat is produced in their local heat island. And maybe I better explain what's actually happening and why dark surfaces are so bad. So there's the sun. It's producing electromagnetic waves that are very fast, very short waves that just rip right through our atmosphere. Very little is absorbed. It hits a dark surface like your coat or whatever, and then it makes the photothermal conversion from light to heat, and then it radiates at a long, slow, lazy wavelength back, and that's what gets trapped by our atmosphere and by greenhouse gases. So if the sun's energy comes in as light, hits a light surface, it goes right back out as light, it doesn't get trapped. Light surfaces really help. This is Detroit. Motorized space on the upper left is both parking lots and building surfaces. So it's about 60% motorized, a term students came up in a design charrette with. And then you can see there's very little green or open space, the lower right. And so obviously there's a lot of albedo enhancement that needs to be done. That photo of Houston so embarrassed the city leaders because it went viral with all those parking lots that they've actually started and have over the last decade or so fill in a lot of those with some arenas and other buildings because they were getting so much heat of another sort from people saying, you know, how can you build a city like this? This is our little town of Ann Arbor. This is a neighborhood not far from downtown called Water Hill. Look at the width of these streets, the size of the paved intersection. I mean, these streets could be half as wide. If you don't want to make them narrower, you could put gravel strips for parking on either side. This is a very low density area. There's a lot, just so much more asphalt than we need. But probably the simplest of all is white paint, where we just paint roofs white. A white roof bounces as much as 4 times as much energy back to outer space as I just described before it makes the photothermal conversion. In is light, out is light. I've been trying to convince the university with another couple of folks to paint all the University of Michigan's roofs white because it's such a cheap way to have an impact. And in my class yesterday of about 200 undergrads, I said, how many of you would be willing to paint our university's roof whites? And every hand just shot up. They'd be delighted to paint them white. What a fun project. You'd have to have some guards around the edge, you know, something to keep people from falling off, but they're up for it. Green roofs, now green roofs are good where you have planted material, especially in hot climates. They do a good job of cooling the building and cooling the air in the city. But in fact, white roofs are 3 times more effective at dealing with climate change per se. Green roofs offer other benefits, so they're not to be dismissed lightly. I mean, they help with stormwater management and, of course, the gardening amenities and food production are good. But they're much more expensive than white paint. These are some engineering students who are painting a roof white in Manhattan, and it doesn't make that building any cooler because that asphalt membrane is on top of 3 or 4 inches of foam probably, or at least a good R factor. So what it does though is it heats the local area up less. They can reduce the city's air temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit with a 5% cut in mortality risk. There was a noticeable difference in this neighborhood. This is my roof on our Armory condo in downtown Ann Arbor, and domestic hot water heaters, a white roof, and solar collectors. Our electric bill is typically about $4.50 a month. And our gas bill is less too. All right, so we just talked about lighter colored surfaces. Now let's talk about waste heat reduction. Less of this sensible heat from tailpipes and chimneys, and also from air conditioners, a big problem. In order to keep total global emissions from new air conditioners from rising, a much more efficient air conditioner would need to go on sale no later than 2020 and capture 80% of the market by 2030. In other words, the new product would have to almost totally replace its rivals in less than a decade. Air conditioners are a big problem. We'll get back to them in a minute. So less waste heat, more walkable, as we've heard today, more transit-oriented, less auto-dependent cities have less waste heat coming out of tailpipes. And here are the ACs. They pump, as much as they cool buildings down, they pump all that hot air right out into the street and reduce tailpipe. So they're a problem. Look at this city. This is, I think, Singapore. To deal with heat waves made more frequently by climate change, the number of AC units is expected more than triple worldwide by 2050, so they better be much better machines. As well as guzzling huge amounts of electricity, AC units contain refrigerants that are potent greenhouse gases. The refrigerants in those machines are really bad. These refrigerants are, in fact, the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in every country on Earth. And if you've ever read Drawdown by Paul Hawken, a book written with about 150 PhD students. The number one most potential is replacing all the refrigerant in all the air conditioners around the world. And then it goes to wind power and reduced food waste is bigger than solar. Food waste is a big problem. So eat this food up. Take it home. Okay, third strategy is dealing with urban heat islands, opening up the street and building canyons to ventilating winds. Well, obviously, like this part of town, the narrower the streets, the higher the buildings, the more heat gets sort of trapped in what's called the urban canyon or street canyon. So it's good, first of all, to lighten them up with lighter colored buildings, both vertical and horizontal surfaces and pavement, but also to ventilate them. Now this is going to surprise you. This is Beijing. They have a problem mainly of air pollution, but again, they're blessed with that problem because when they deal with air pollution, they're dealing with climate change. But air pollution is so bad, they are now tearing down buildings in Beijing to let more air get through their city. Sometimes new buildings. Pretty radical. How many have been to Beijing? Yeah, you know, the air can get pretty bad there. Shanghai too. By 2060, the world's projected to add another 2.5 trillion square feet of buildings, or an area equal to the entire current global building stock. Doubling it. This is well, not entirely true because we take some square footage offline. This is the equivalent of adding an entire New York City to the planet every 34 days for the next 40 years. Not good. So the final strategy is cool microclimates. Trees and vegetation to shade, filter, cool the air, while doing lots of other good things. So I'm going to walk you through this long list because it's fascinating in my opinion. These are the things that trees do. They beautify, they provide shade, they retain soil, prevent erosion, they detain stormwater, they sequester carbon dioxide, they produce oxygen, they filter particulate pollution, they cool the air by their leaves which evapotranspire. They provide bird and animal habitat. They produce flowers, fruit, fragrance. They offer tree climbing for children. They absorb sound. They reduce crime, as I'll show you in a minute. They increase real estate values. They provide wood for construction, furniture, and wood for fuel in some places. Planting and maintenance jobs to keep them alive and happy. They humanize overscaled urban spaces. They soothe the psyche. And according to one sign I read in Poland outside Warsaw, they soak up nuclear blasts. I don't think so. And there are lots of economic benefits of, you know, just a lot of jobs associated with it. Trees are the most prominent organism on our planet. There are 3 trillion of them. There used to be almost twice that number because we cut down a lot, 15 billion a year. We do plant a lot, but only about 1/3 as many as we cut down. So trees are wonderful. That's a street in Buenos Aires. Street trees they just make cathedrals out of streets. And they have health benefits. As these deadly heat waves become commonplace, we have to learn to see shade as a civic resource, in line with the talk about parks, that is shared by all. In the shade, overheated bodies return to equilibrium, blood circulation improves, people think more clearly, they can see better. In a physiological sense, they are themselves again because of shade. Few people vulnerable to heat stress and exhaustion. For people who are particularly vulnerable to heat stress and exhaustion, outdoor workers, the elderly, the homeless, that can be the difference between life and death. Shade is thus an index of inequality, a requirement for public health, and a mandate for urban planners and designers. And there's the sheer beauty, whether it's New York City or Savannah, Georgia. That's that street in Buenos Aires. That other street on the left is actually Saigon. Because urban trees grow bigger, their shade reduces air conditioning loads. They mitigate climate change 16 times more than a non-urban tree. That's because non-urban, in forests, they have much more competition. They don't have much competition in cities. They get much bigger canopies. Trees in your city, in your metro area alone, provide an estimated $350 million of value in annual carbon storage. The estimated value of this forest, your local forest, your urban trees, metropolitan trees, is over $50 billion. A major insect infestation can cost billions of dollars. It's serious money. Trees are our best friends. And to the extent that a number of cities have adopted canopy goals, including Chicago, Washington, D.C. has a citywide 40% tree canopy goal. To achieve this goal by 2032, the city must increase its canopy over the existing 35% by planting about 9,000 trees a year. Seattle plans to increase from 18 to 30%, in 30 years. Here's some of my favorite trees. I didn't take this one on the right. I harvested that from some online site, but look at that. I mean, trees are venerable objects, creatures, organisms. They're the oldest living things on the planet. This is older than the pyramids. These trees are older than the pyramids. And they get big. And they are unusual. And they add value to real estate. In a mixed-use, walkable neighborhood with tree-lined streets, they add about $22,000. This is pretty old. They probably add, $35,000 now. Portland, the sort of poster child for a lot of these issues. But here's the crime one. A Baltimore study of the urban tree effect found that a 10% increase in neighborhood trees corresponded to a 12% decrease in crime. Because trees also help cool the city, filter air pollution, reduce stress on the sewer system, and beautify a neighborhood, increasing the urban tree canopy is a multi-purpose strategy for improving public safety. Now, we see a lot of these designs where buildings are greened on their rooftops and balconies and facades and so on. I think it's a bit oversold, because installing and watering, fertilizing, pruning, and replacing particularly larger trees is costly and difficult. This is one of the few build projects, Bosco Verticali in Milan. I don't know how cost effective it is compared to street trees. I would argue you'd be better off spending all that money on more street trees. Like Central Park and other great oases in cities as dense as Manhattan or boroughs as dense as Manhattan. It's hard to beat trees along streets and in parks. Hard to beat it. So let's sort of review. Climate change needs to be addressed. We all agree on that. Mixed-use, walkable, transit-served cities have lower carbon footprints per capita. I think we all agree on that. Maybe you don't agree, the bigger and denser the better. Cities dampen birth rates. This lowers humanity's total carbon footprint. The reason when people move from the countryside to the city in the developing world is, yes, they get richer and their eco footprint goes up, but their birth rate goes down faster than their eco footprint goes up, with the exception of a few cities. So this is a big deal. It's not so important in the US, but this lower birth rate is important because what's eating the planet up is the number of people times their eco or carbon footprint. So population is a big part of that, and I do talk about overpopulation in my book. Usually that dot is not connected to climate change. into cities and moving to cities is rarely connected to migration to cities. Addressing urban eons also addresses climate change directly and in the same measure. Fabulous, good luck. And because UHIs are a more immediate and manageable problem, as I said, they can be more compelling in motivating people to act. So voila, you add it all up, cities may be our last best hope. Thank you. Questions? And then I do have some books that I'm selling at a discount, but I do have to leave to go to another event at UIC where they're starting an urban design program, which is really good news. Thank you. So we do have, that went pretty fast. Any questions, comments? Yes?
I'm fascinated by your comment that a city is an ecosystem. You talked about an urban planning program. Is there urban ecology or?
Yeah, urban ecology would often be in a school or college of environmental studies or whatever. It's called the School of Environment and Sustainability on our campus. It has different names. But yeah, urban ecology is a field now. I don't know about University of Chicago and your other higher institutions of learning. I think this new program they're talking about, they're just getting underway at UIC, will definitely deal with urban ecology. I mean, it's just another one of many terms, but it's pretty apt and descriptive in this case. Yes, sir.
Doug,
This is fellow dean,
yeah.
Tom Fisher.
So Jeffrey West's work, you're right, he and Louise Betancourt talk about the fact that as cities get bigger, they get more creative, more innovative, but he also says other things go up, negative things go up. There's more crime. There's more of negatives as well as positives. And yet you also make the good point that planting trees reduces crime, which makes me think that of any entity that needs to have an intensive tree planting activity, it's big cities, right? Because they do bring negative.
Yeah, there is more crime.
They're negative as well as positive comes with size.
Yeah, there's more crime. I don't know per acre. I don't know about per capita though. You think there's more crime per? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And what kind of crime? Violent crimes versus other crimes. But that's a good point. He's speaking later. He's a much better speaker. How are we doing? We have a little time. No, yes, ma'am.
Well, that was going to be my question. Can you expand a little bit more on the correlation between the reduction of crime and the street trees?
Well, the one slide I have is that one about Baltimore, and it's not that dramatic. What was it, a 10% increase in trees and a 12% decrease in crime. So, but I don't know if crime rates are higher per capita. I suspect they probably are.
Is there anything in the research that talks about why or how
Why?
it happens? I've been looking for this research for a long time.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of it that I found.
Crime versus heat, crime versus trees, crime versus density. I can't help you.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Who's that?
Sullivan, and also at University of Illinois, they've done research on whether families. They looked at the Robert Taylor homes and found that families that could see nature had much less dysfunction than families that couldn't see a tree, for example.
Right, and the Data Foundation and other neuroscience centers are starting to research on if you see a tree out a window, it actually calms your heart rate.
Mm. Well,
Many of us who love trees needed science to tell us that.
yeah.
Right.
But that's true of people recovering in hospitals. If they have a window, they recover faster. They tend to be big internal load dominated buildings, big fat buildings. So there are a lot of rooms in hospitals without windows. But they have now found that pictures of nature in a hospital room actually helps recovery.
Even our kids can watch the screen when the rest of us really like real leaves.
Yeah.
But the EU has a policy where they're trying to have all their cities like 20 or 30% green coverage. So London's going to get there by 2030. And the forests in Europe have grown much more in the last 100 years than ours.
Yeah.
Because we're still eating up land for corn.
Yeah.
and soybeans.
Yeah, you know, I think another big reason Europe is ahead of us, they have maybe 100 fabulous cities, and we've got maybe 10 or 15. We have a supply problem. That's why I have an affordability problem in cities, because there aren't that many great cities people are moving to. In Europe, there's so many of them. Yes, housing is expensive, but the affordability problem is increased here dramatically by the lack of great cities. We just don't have that many of them. We need more of them. The Indianapolises, the Charlottes, the Memphises, these other cities need to become better cities so people want to move there rather than Chicago or New York or San Francisco. The land costs now this is a new chart that just came out. New development in San Francisco, the land value is equal to 81% of the development costs because so many people want to live there. And the next 5 on the list are all in California. They're all on 60, 70%. Think of that. Buying the land can be as much as $4 out of every $5 in a new development. It's because we don't have enough of these places. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about like what can be done in cities that are already built up about the urban canyon effect?
Well, you can paint the roofs. You can put in lighter color pavement. You can, like LA, actually whitewash the streets. The vertical surfaces are a little more expensive to change, but in some cases you could paint them a lighter color or cover them with a lighter color. But you're not, unless you're Beijing, you're probably not going to tear buildings down. It's just a little too radical. But older buildings, you might not replace when they do finish their lifetime. You also had your hand up, yeah.
Early in your presentation, you had a slide showing the net migration by major metro area associated with climate change by the end of the century. I was curious about the source and the scale of it.
You're talking about those ones like of Stuttgart? No.
US cities.
Oh, the 2 bar charts.
No, it was just kind of a map with blue and red.
Yeah, that was way back, too far to go back. I just got that very recently. That's a new chart, and if you, later on we can look at the bottom, I bet there's a little source.
I didn't see it, so I was curious.
Well, it might be off the slide. We could check that on my computer. Yes, sir.
You had 2 stack bar graphs on here about carbon based on 2 different urban and non-urban. And you compared it embodied energy for the 2 on building materials. I noticed that in the denser population comparison, it had less it had more embodied energy compared to the less dense, and I was curious if you could explain that. I would think urban development, you have more efficient building, more people, less services.
I don't think so.
You'd have
Let's go back to that one.
this one's not too far to go back to.
You're talking. No, I think you're talking about.
There's 2 stacked bar graphs.
Oh my God, there are a lot of. Not that one. Not that one. This one. That one.
More embodied energy in low density, where you have more surface area per person.
Yeah, so green materials are bigger in low density than the city. High density, the green bar is smaller.
Per person.
Per person. Oh, well, what's your point, I guess?
I think I went through it quickly.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are the economies of scale, the economies of urbanism. this is about as dramatic a slide as I could show you. And let's say it's a little bit off. It's not this favorable. It's still just much, much better. Yes, ma'am. A sweet spot. Oh, really?
I'm just asking.
Well, they say the bigger and denser, the better.
Don't know if that's true.
I mean, I can just go by the charts I harvest. I don't draw them. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciated your tribute to the trees. 2 years ago, our think tank was on biophilia, and we talked about, and some of the research comes from Right Green, where they've put together a list of 14 ways to design with biophilic design. So that might be in conjunction.
Yeah, biophilia is a good term. Did I not use it at any point? I never used biophilia? Good point. I think we're out of time and we seem to be out of questions. All right, good luck. Thank you again. Oh, yeah.